In the first demo, we are going to present a simple component, simple Razor component. We are going to actually copy the entire working JavaScript solution, transit it to TypeScript, and then we are going to move that forward and transition that TypeScript solution to Blazor one. And during this demo, we are going to talk about a couple of things like Razor components, Razor code blocks, one-way binding, which we are going to use instead of calling JavaScript methods. And lastly, we are going to talk a little bit more about Lambda variable capturing, which, as we will see, will going to introduce some trouble for us. And here we are in the Visual Studio. We will mainly focus in this demo, in this video, on the demo 1 project. We have two directories, end and start, and contains the Rail component that is actually ready and already implemented. And in this video, we are going to replicate that solution into Rail component file. As we can see, it's basically quite empty. It is actually generated by Visual Studio. If we are going to create some Razor component, we are going to get the same markup as here. So let us both delete those file and that markup. Instead, we are going to insert that kind of markup, which is going to actually basically render 5 elements, allowing us to rate a component. Let us run the solution to see how it is working. And if we are going to move into the first style, refresh the page, we can see that our component is basically working as expected. The only problem is that solution is 100% based on the JavaScript files we have in our project. Let us take a second and explain how the internal logic of that component is working. Yeah, first thing we have the class attribute, which is defining the classes for our components. We use the library called fontAwesome. That class actually in particular is defining our shape of our icons. As for that one, it is actually defining the stylings for our shape. So if the icon is highlighted or not. Besides that, we have 3 event handlers. On click, event handler is going to fire the setRate JavaScript method, which is internally going to set the rate variable based on the icon we have clicked. So maybe let us go into that file. We can find the actual method we are going to call following the namespace of it. So if we are going to go into the www root directory, we can find the JS folder with the main.ts file within it. And if we are going to look for this namespace I just copied earlier, we can see that this file will register our class within that namespace. And as I said before, on click, on set rate, we are going to actually set the rate of the icon and update the icon display. That method, as you can see, is actually called every time something is changing, because it is responsible for getting all of the rate icons, and for each of those it will recalculate if the icon should be styled as active or inactive, and it will apply the proper styles accordingly. As for those rate and temporary rate variables, the rate is actually the number which we are going to select, and the temp rate is the inner rate value for the stars based on our pointer position. Yeah, so if I'm going to hover over the first icon, the temporary icon will be updated, and that value will be updated each time I hovered over some other icon. Yes, and if I'm going to click that icon, in that moment the temporary rate will be reassigned to the rate value, as the temporary rate will be the same as the index of the hovered icon. The rate will be just the same. So that's it for the logic of that file. So now, as we are understanding how it is working internally, let's just replace this TypeScript logic with our own. In order to do that, let's replace the default code block for the Razor component. We are going to use that kind of markup. It's basically the same thing as I showed you earlier. It also consists of active and inactive style, rate and temporary rate variables, and a couple of methods we saw earlier. What we didn't copy from that file is the update rate icon active state method. The reason for that is, well, pretty simple. We are going to use this special kind of feature within Blazor called one-way binding. So we are actually going to recalculate those styles dynamically without needing to run that method each time something is changed. So let us go right to it. Yeah, first we are going to actually replace those default DOM event handlers with something called Blazor directives. If I'm going to just add the add sign at the beginning of each of those DOM event handlers, those will be treated as Blazor directives, and each of those actually have the same name as the default DOM event handlers, and even all of those are going to by default pass the object of the type mouse event arguments to supply the values we might need in order to react on that event. But for our purpose, those objects are actually not needed. So we have a couple of solutions here. We can either pass the name of the method of the delegate we are going to use, as long as we are not expecting from that delegate to receive some additional parameters that Blazor directives cannot provide. So for example, if we are going to execute showRate methods, and that method needs the index of the methods, we just simply cannot use that form of syntax or that one. We have to use lambda expressions, so we are going to efficiently ignore the argument provided by Blazor, Yes, and we are going to provide our own parameter instead. The down thing of that statement, that syntax, is that that method will be called only after we trigger the event. So as we will see later in this demo, uh, after Blazor generates all 5 icons, each of those on mouse over events for all of those icons will be fired, actually not for the parameter with value 1, 0, 2, 3, and 4, but all of those icons will be fired with the parameter of 4. The last thing we need to replace is that line. We are going to actually calculate those styles based on the index in the for loop and based on the value given to us by its active method. As you can see, for the rest of the fixed classes we are not going to touch them. Let us style that code a little bit, and if we are going to fire that solution, and after refreshing the page, we can see that our component is working, except for this behavior we have talked about. As we can see, on every mouse over, all of those icons are highlighted, because as we said earlier, that event will be triggered and the function will be called for with the I variable, and that variable will be for after evaluating this loop, which Blazor did because it already generates all of those icons. So in order to fix that, we will actually need a local variable. So let us pass it. And instead of using that reference to the I variable, we are going to reference the local variable inside the for loop. As for its active method, we can use the index local variable, but it's optional because that statement will be calculated on the fly while going through the loop. So it will be calculated for 0, for 1, for 2, and for 4. But that lambda statement won't be executed before the Blazor will reach the end of the rendering process, which means that that method we have no other choice but to fire with the for. Yes, and if we are going to refresh our component one more time, we can see everything is working fine. So with that one last fix, we actually solve all of those steps. And we can move forward to the next demo.